Usually when we talk about physical exhaustion, there's a really logical, highly visible trail of breadcrumbs to follow.
Right, like a clear cause and effect.
Exactly. Like, say you ran a half marathon on a Saturday morning. Your muscle glycogen is completely depleted, your joints are inflamed, and your body just sends this massive, undeniable signal that says stop.
And you just collapse on the couch to rest.
Yeah, and it makes perfect sense. It's a simple, undeniable equation of physical output versus necessary biological recovery. But I want to talk about a very different kind of fatigue today.
The kind that doesn't make logical sense.
Right. Have you ever found yourself sitting on that exact same couch at the end of a Tuesday, having done absolutely nothing physically demanding? I mean, you haven't run a step, you haven't lifted anything heavier than a laptop.
You might not have even dealt with an external crisis, like a screaming boss or a sudden emergency.
Exactly, and yet you feel completely, utterly down to your marrow drained. A weariness so profound that sleep doesn't even seem to fix it. Because it's a fatigue born entirely from the sheer invisible effort of managing your own mind.
Wow. Yeah. That quiet, invisible exhaustion is really the defining epidemic of our modern psychological landscape.
It's everywhere.
It is incredibly pervasive. But because it leaves no physical bruises, and has no straightforward medical diagnosis, it remains almost entirely unspoken. What you are describing is the profound exhaustion of constantly, relentlessly supervising yourself.
Supervision is the perfect word for it. It genuinely feels like your brain is this chaotic, slightly dangerous toddler.
And you are the exhausted parent.
You're just constantly chasing it around a room with a broom. You are sweeping up bad thoughts the second they drop. You are violently forcing good or productive thoughts into place.
Telling the mind to calm down, and then 5 minutes later, berating it for not being driven enough.
It's endless. You sit in your living room doing absolutely nothing visible to the outside world, but internally, you've just run a grueling emotional triathlon.
And the tragic irony here is that modern culture doesn't just normalize that internal triathlon. It actively applauds it.
Oh, absolutely.
We've been sold this pervasive, deeply damaging idea that a quote-unquote healthy mind is one that is under constant, rigorous, unyielding surveillance and control.
Right. Like we equate psychological well-being with totalitarian internal management.
Exactly.
Which, that brings us to the core of what we are doing today. We are taking a deep dive into a text that just takes an absolute sledgehammer to that entire concept.
It really does.
We are looking at the 2026 book, The Resistance Paradox by Sandeep Chavan. And our mission here is massive. We are exploring a radical, fundamental, structural shift away from everything conventional self-help has taught us over the last 50 years.
A total paradigm shift.
Right. We are going to dismantle this deeply ingrained, almost religious belief that you must aggressively and violently control your thoughts in order to find peace. And instead, we're going to look at how simply understanding the biological and psychological movements of your mind can offer the genuine, lasting relief that relentless self-policing never could.
Chavan is essentially suggesting we've been drafted into a brutal war against ourselves.
And it's a war we were biologically never meant to fight.
The shift Chavan introduces is just staggering when you truly sit with it. He is completely redefining the nature of human suffering.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does he redefine it?
Well, we are entirely conditioned to view our internal struggles. So things like looping anxiety, chronic overthinking, or even stubborn resistance to making changes. We view those as personal defects.
Right. We see it as a failure of our own willpower.
Or a deep flaw in our character. But Chavan argues that it is absolutely not a failure of willpower. It is instead a fundamental misinterpretation of the mind's natural biological signaling system.
A misinterpretation.
Right. And when you misinterpret a biological signal, you inevitably apply the wrong solution. And applying the wrong solution with increasing force over and over again for years, that is precisely what generates that profound, bone-deep exhaustion you described at the start.
Man, so before we can even begin to understand how the mind actually operates under Chavan's framework, we have a massive unlearning process ahead of us, don't we?
We really do. We have to dismantle what is arguably the most pervasive, exhausting, and, frankly, well-marketed myth that modern culture has handed us.
We have to talk about the ideology of forced positivity.
Exactly. And how the simple act of staying positive was weaponized into a psychological trap.
It's so insidious because it sounds so harmless, right?
It does. And it's a trap that has been quietly and methodically set over several decades, bleeding from corporate management seminars directly into mainstream culture.
But it didn't start out toxic, did it?
No, Not at all. If we look back at the origins of the positive thinking movement, it originally emerged as a gentle form of emotional support.
Like a lifeline.
Exactly. A simple reminder to a friend or a community not to lose hope entirely during periods of profound darkness or tragedy. In that specific, localized context, positivity was beautiful, humane, and totally necessary for survival.
But then something shifted.
Over time, the mechanism was co-opted. It morphed from a supportive tool into a cultural ideology, and eventually it hardened into a strict moral obligation.
A moral obligation. I mean, that carries a terrifying amount of weight.
It really does.
It implies that if I am not radiating positivity, I am not merely experiencing sadness or frustration, I am actually a bad person. Like, I am failing at the basic requirement of modern existence.
That is the exact psychological burden Chavan described. And he introduces this brilliant framework called the Emotional Performance Society.
Oh, I highlighted that entire section, Emotional Performance Society.
It's such a clarifying term.
Yeah.
He points out that in previous eras, human beings simply lived their lives and experienced the natural, chaotic, emotional weather that comes with the friction of existence.
Right, like grief, anger, joy, boredom. They were just weather patterns.
Exactly. But today, we no longer simply live. We are expected to perform emotional stability and perpetual growth while living.
It has become a continuous, grueling psychological expectation.
Precisely. Under this framework, you aren't just allowed to be genuinely heartbroken or grieving a loss or absolutely burned out by an unsustainable economic system.
You are immediately expected to be healing.
Right. You are expected to be finding the silver lining or monetizing your trauma into a growth mindset.
It feels like we're all actors trapped on a stage, you know? And there's a tyrannical director constantly screaming from the shadows, "Smile more, look like you're thriving."
Even while the stage props are literally catching fire around you.
Exactly. The roof is caving in and you're just standing there forcing a smile. And Chavan points out how biologically exhausting this performance is because it violently splits the modern individual into two distinct entities.
The split is where the real damage happens.
Yeah, because there is the vulnerable self actually experiencing the very real pain. And then there is the internal supervisor standing over them with a clipboard, constantly evaluating, grading, and correcting that experience in real time.
And that internal split is ground zero for what psychologists call secondary suffering.
Secondary suffering. Can you break down the actual neurological and biological mechanics of that? Why does forced positivity create such an intense contrast?
Sure. Let's consider a scenario of genuine difficulty. Let's say a profound personal grief or severe nervous system level workplace burnout.
Okay, very relatable examples.
When you encounter that environment, your biology naturally reflects those conditions. Your nervous system compresses. It initiates a parasympathetic withdrawal.
So your body just kind of shuts down to protect itself.
Exactly. It slows your cognitive processing down. It generates heavy feelings of lethargy, sadness, or fear. And that is a highly intelligent, biologically appropriate response to a disruptive or damaging event.
Your body is basically trying to force you to retreat and conserve energy.
Right. But modern positivity culture intervenes immediately, almost reflexively, and shouts, "Stop. That's a low vibration emotion. Correct that thought immediately."
Stay positive. Focus on gratitude.
Yes. So the system is blocked from doing what it needs to do.
So in that moment, I'm no longer just carrying the immense weight of the original grief.
No, you've added an entirely new burden.
I am carrying the grief, and on top of that, I am carrying the massive, heavy shame of failing to be positive and productive about my own grief. I mean, I'm failing at feeling bad.
You are carrying the original biological pain, plus the stress of the cognitive meta-analysis, plus the intense shame of the perceived moral failure. The emotional system is now completely at war with itself.
One part is feeling the disturbance, and the other part is trying to crush it.
Exactly. One biological mechanism is genuinely experiencing necessary disturbance, and the cognitive mechanism is aggressively trying to suppress and sanitize it. So the mind entirely loses the freedom to move honestly through its own environment.
Chavan points out a very specific, devastating example of this in the text.
The grieving person.
Yes. Think of a grieving person being told by well-meaning friends to just focus on the good times and move on. Or an exhausted worker concluding they just aren't mentally resilient enough to handle the modern hustle.
Which is such a dark inversion of reality.
Right. They are taking a massive systemic issue like a culture of overwork or the universal human reality of death and internalizing it as a personal, individual moral failure.
They do. And this brings us to a highly illuminating concept from Appendix C of the book, which Chavan calls borrowed coherence.
Okay, yes. Borrowed coherence. This concept completely blew my mind.
It is the key to understanding the billion-dollar self-help industry. It explains why all those books with endless focus on forced positivity, vision boards, and rigid morning routines often feel so incredibly euphoric at first.
But ultimately leave us feeling more broken than before.
Precisely.
I know anyone listening to this has experienced that exact cycle. You hit a low point, you buy a best-selling motivational book, or you listen to a high-energy guru, and you get this incredible rushing high.
You feel unstoppable for about 3 days.
Exactly. You wake up the next day thinking, yes, I finally cracked the code. I am completely fixed. You do the ice baths, you write the affirmations.
But the high evaporates.
It never, ever lasts. Why does our brain trick us like that?
The illusion is created by borrowed coherence. Let's look at what happens neurologically when you adopt a new, highly regimented self-help protocol. Say, waking up at 5 a.m., exercising rigidly, writing 10 things you are grateful for, and policing every negative thought that arises.
Sounds exhausting already.
It is. But when your internal nervous system feels chaotic, depressed, or overwhelmed, imposing that intense external structure acts as an artificial lifeline. You are quite literally borrowing organizational structure from an external source to prop up your internal collapse.
And for a brief window, that feels fantastic.
It provides a massive dopamine hit because it reduces uncertainty.
Yeah.
It organizes your fragmented attention, temporarily overrides the emotional compression you were feeling, and gives you a profound illusion of total control.
It feels like a permanent cure.
But it's just a rental.
You don't actually own the architecture of that piece.
Exactly. It is a short-term lease on someone else's nervous system. The rigid self-help structure borrows coherence, but it does absolutely nothing to fundamentally address or change the underlying emotional misalignments.
Or the unresolved traumas, or the actual environmental friction you're living in.
Right. And because you are a living biological system, natural fluctuation inevitably returns. You get a cold, you have a terrible day at work, your child gets sick.
The external environment pushes back.
It always does. The rigid 5 a.m. structure cracks under the weight of reality. And here is where the true damage happens.
Because the self-help industry convinced you that the euphoric high was your new permanent baseline,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. So when the natural friction returns, you interpret it as a catastrophic personal failure. You think, I lost the magic. I slipped back. I am completely back to square one.
But Chavan argues brilliantly that you're not failing.
Not at all. The return of friction after a motivational high isn't a failure of character. It is simply the natural, unavoidable fluctuation of a conscious biological system interacting with a complex world.
Now, I have to step in and play devil's advocate here for a second, because this is a radical departure from everything we're taught.
It definitely goes against the grain.
A lot of people listening might be getting anxious thinking, wait a minute, is being optimistic actually bad for my health? If I don't actively try to force myself to look on the bright side, won't I just spiral into an absolute abyss of cynicism and depression? I mean, I need something to hold me together.
That's a very common fear when people first encounter this work.
Let me try an analogy to see if I'm grasping Chavan's nuance here. Forced positivity, the way this book describes it, sounds exactly like wearing a tightly laced Victorian corset.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
It violently forces you to stand up straight. It makes you look incredibly put together, highly functional, and perfect to the outside world.
But underneath the fabric.
Underneath, your internal organs are literally being crushed out of their natural positions, and it makes it absolutely impossible to take a deep, natural, restorative breath.
Yeah.
But the fear is, if I take the corset off, won't my spine just snap? Won't I just slouch and completely fall apart?
The corset metaphor is perhaps the most accurate visualization of this dynamic. Think about the physical reality of a corset. It provides the absolute illusion of structural integrity, but it does so entirely through external mechanical force.
Right.
What happens to the actual core muscles of a human body underneath a corset if worn for years?
They atrophy.
Exactly. They become incredibly weak. They completely forget how to hold the skeletal structure upright naturally because the rigid external constraint has been doing all the heavy lifting.
So by constantly forcing positivity, we're actually weakening our natural emotional resilience.
Yes. Chavan is absolutely not arguing that natural optimism, genuine hope, or constructive forward-moving action are bad things. Human beings need hope to survive.
Right, he's not saying we should all just be miserable.
But we must recognize the massive structural difference between naturally emerging positivity, which bubbles up authentically from a place of actual internal coherence, felt safety, and alignment with your environment, and psychologically enforced positivity.
You're just driven entirely by a terror of your own internal instability.
Exactly.
So naturally emerging positivity is having genuinely strong back and core muscles. Enforced positivity is just tying the corset tighter every time you feel tired.
That's a perfect way to put it. Enforced positivity freezes the biological system in place. It absolutely refuses to give the nervous system permission for honest human experience to exist.
And frozen emotional systems don't eventually become peaceful.
No, they become incredibly tense, highly brittle, and prone to shattering under pressure.
So if you finally decide to take the psychological corset off, yes, you are going to slouch for a bit.
You might have to spend some time actually feeling how weak and neglected your natural emotional muscles have become. It might feel sloppy and vulnerable.
But it is only by removing that artificial constraint that you can even begin the process of building genuine, sustainable internal strength.
A resilience that doesn't rely on the exhausting daily chore of policing your own mind.
And, that perfectly illuminates the next massive trap the book identifies. Because we have culturally bought into this terrifying idea that we must always be positive, always be actively healing, always be wearing the corset of self-improvement, we have inadvertently developed a hyper-vigilant psychological habit just to ensure we aren't slipping.
The surveillance state of the mind.
Exactly. We are constantly, obsessively checking the internal mirror to make sure the corset is perfectly tight. And this relentless checking leads directly to the sheer exhaustion of the watchful eye, the trap of recursive self-monitoring.
This specific dynamic is arguably the defining psychological characteristic of the modern digital era. Chavan identifies this as an absolute epidemic, a phenomenon he terms awareness fatigue.
Awareness fatigue. That phrase alone feels like a paradox.
It does sound counterintuitive at first.
We are constantly bombarded with messaging that awareness is the ultimate goal of human development. We download apps to meditate so we can be more aware. We spend thousands of dollars on therapy to become highly self-aware. We read Stoic philosophy to build awareness. How in the world can we be fatigued by the very thing that is supposed to save us?
To understand the fatigue, we have to look at the evolutionary trajectory of human attention.
Okay, take me back.
Historically, across hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, human awareness was primarily directed outward into the physical environment. We utilized our hyper-awareness for tangible survival.
Like scanning the savannah for predators.
Exactly. Navigating complex physical terrain, reading the subtle social cues of our immediate tribe to avoid exile, and securing food. The observer, the core self, was positioned inside, looking out the window at the world.
But modern life completely flipped that.
Modern life, devoid of constant physical predators but flooded with psychological pressures, has caused a radical inward collapse of that attention. Our immense evolutionary capacity for awareness has turned recursively inward upon itself.
So we are no longer simply living our lives.
No, we are constantly, obsessively observing ourselves living our lives. We aren't merely thinking thoughts. We are thinking deeply about the fact that we are thinking thoughts.
We evaluate our immediate reactions, we deeply question the validity of our fleeting emotions, and we constantly monitor our progress on the timeline of our own healing.
What was once a tool for environmental awareness has transformed into a totalitarian system of internal surveillance.
Let's ground this in reality, because Chavan provides this agonizingly relatable example of a mental loop in the text. It shows how innocent this starts, and how quickly it becomes a nightmare.
The Friday night party example.
Yes. Let's say someone has been doing a lot of self-help reading, and they are desperately trying to figure out, who am I really? What is my authentic self? They want to be deeply authentic. So a very simple thought appears on a Friday afternoon. I don't really want to go to this social event tonight.
A completely normal feeling?
Right. Now, maybe 20 years ago, that person just wouldn't go, or they'd go and be a little grumpy in the corner, and that would be the end of it. But under the modern regime of self-surveillance, the recursive monitor steps in, the interrogation light switches on, and the loop begins.
And the escalation is incredibly fast and incredibly punishing.
Walk us through the loop.
That initial thought, I don't want to go, is just a passing biological or emotional fluctuation. It's a blip. But instead of letting that blip pass across the radar screen, the self grips it violently and begins a full-scale interrogation.
The inner monologue fires up.
Right. It starts asking, wait, why don't I want to go? Is it just because I'm tired? Or is it because I'm secretly an avoidant introvert? Is my social anxiety returning? Have I completely regressed in all the therapy I've done this year?
What does this hesitation mean about my fundamental capacity to maintain human friendships?
Am I slowly isolating myself to a lonely, bitter life?
And within 30 seconds, a completely benign, fleeting feeling of wanting to stay home in sweatpants has escalated into a catastrophic, full-blown existential crisis about identity, worth, and the future trajectory of their entire life.
It's exhausting just to hear it out loud.
Mm.
And we have to examine what is happening to the physical body and the nervous system during that recursive loop.
Right, because it's not just thoughts, it's a physical reaction.
The nervous system is no longer simply processing the very mild, manageable fatigue of not wanting to attend a dinner party. It is now carrying that original mild feeling, heavily compounded by the immense biological stress of the cognitive meta-analysis.
Plus the sudden spike of cortisol from the fear of psychological regression.
And the deep, heavy shame of the identity crisis. The system literally becomes overloaded and short-circuits from the sheer weight of its own observation.
And the self-help industry just pours gasoline on this fire continuously.
It really does. It has successfully commodified this surveillance, turning the human mind into a constant, never-ending project that demands uninterrupted supervision.
We are aggressively marketed to. Buy this specialized journal to track and grade your daily moods. Download this biometric app to ensure your meditation is hitting the correct brainwave depths.
Use this complex psychological framework to rigidly analyze your every interaction to see which attachment style you are exhibiting today.
But I have to challenge this because this feels like a very dangerous tightrope. If I'm listening to this, my immediate thought is, isn't self-awareness the absolute holy grail of personal growth?
That's the million-dollar question.
You go to therapy specifically to become self-aware of your blind spots. You read psychology to understand your triggers. If we abandon awareness, aren't we just flying blind? How do we possibly delineate in real time when we have crossed that invisible, blurry line from a healthy, productive self-awareness into this highly toxic, exhausting self-surveillance?
It is a critical distinction, and it forms the philosophical crux of Chavan's argument in this section. The profound difference between the two states lies entirely in the concept of release.
Release. Okay, explain that.
Healthy, productive awareness observes a phenomenon, acknowledges it, and then allows for natural movement. It acts like a quiet witness. It notes, I see that a feeling of fear is present in my chest right now. And then it gives that fear the space to physically and emotionally move through the nervous system without immediately attempting to dissect its origins, label it, or violently destroy it.
So it just watches.
Yes. Toxic self-surveillance recursive monitoring does the exact opposite. It grips the emotional movement with a clenched fist and absolutely refuses to let go.
It continuously re-enters the exact same psychological territory.
Obsessively evaluating, attempting to correct the feeling, and frantically searching for a sense of absolute certainty that just doesn't exist.
Let me try to visualize this. Healthy awareness is like standing on the bank of a river and watching a single, strangely shaped leaf float by on the current. You notice it, you think, that's an interesting leaf, and you let it float out of sight.
The perfect metaphor.
But toxic surveillance is diving headfirst into the freezing river, violently grabbing the leaf, dragging it to shore, putting it under an electron microscope, and frantically demanding to know exactly which tree it fell from, why it fell today, and what this specific leaf means for the overarching ecological future of the entire forest.
That's exactly it. And the tragedy is you eventually drown in that freezing river because you are expending every ounce of your survival energy analyzing a piece of debris.
Wow.
Chavan highlights a deeply flawed assumption we make. The self falsely believes that if it just analyzes the pain deeply enough, if it maps every single angle of the trauma, it will eventually unlock absolute certainty and total emotional control.
But recursive observation never creates certainty.
Never. Its only mechanical function is amplification. A passing emotional fluctuation, a brief moment of sadness or irritation that might have naturally dissolved on its own in 5 minutes if left entirely alone, becomes psychologically stabilized, hardened, and magnified exponentially simply because you refuse to stop staring at it.
The observer becomes hopelessly entangled in the observation.
Exactly.
It reminds me of semantic satiation. You know when you stare at a perfectly normal word on a piece of paper and you repeat it over and over again out loud, and suddenly it loses all linguistic meaning and just sounds like a bizarre, terrifying alien noise.
Yes, that's a brilliant comparison.
We do that exact process to our own emotional states. We stare at a normal human sadness until it morphs into a monstrous pathology.
We do.
Which tells me, if this constant obsessive monitoring and judging of our thoughts is the primary source of our exhaustion, we have to completely detonate our foundational understanding of what a thought actually is.
We have to start from scratch.
Right. If thoughts aren't these absolute profound truths or direct demands from the universe that we must constantly supervise, what on earth are they?
To answer that, Chavan takes us through a radical, sweeping deconstruction of what he terms the illusion of mental authorship.
The illusion of mental authorship.
Every single day, we walk around operating under this deeply ingrained, unquestioned assumption that simply because a thought occurs inside the physical boundaries of our skull, we consciously, deliberately, and intentionally manufactured that thought step by step.
We possess an absolute belief in centralized cognitive control.
Exactly.
Right? It's like the ultimate hangover from Descartes. I think, therefore I am. We've internalized the idea that if the thought is happening in my brain, I am the sole creator of it, and therefore the content of that thought acts as a direct, damning mirror reflecting who I fundamentally am as a human being.
But Chavan leverages modern neuroscience and systems theory to argue that conscious biological systems absolutely do not operate with that kind of linear mechanical simplicity.
You are not a factory boss ordering thoughts to be built on an assembly line.
Not at all. He introduces the core metaphor of the entire book here, and it is a framework that provides profound, instantaneous relief if you can truly internalize its implications.
The bubbles.
Yes. Thoughts are merely bubbles naturally rising through a highly complex, dynamic psychological and biological field. They are not direct commands. They are not prophetic visions of the future.
And they are emphatically not absolute permanent declarations of your core identity.
Precisely.
I want to spend some real time unpacking this bubble metaphor because it challenges everything. If I am not the deliberate author of the thought, if I didn't consciously sit down and write the script for it, where is it actually coming from? Who or what is blowing the bubbles?
The bubbles emerge spontaneously from a constantly interacting, highly sensitive ecosystem. Chavan meticulously lists the layers of this field. When a thought pops into your head, it is the momentary byproduct of a massive collision of variables.
What kind of variables?
Things like your current baseline biology, the immediate state of your autonomic nervous system, fragmented pieces of long-term memory, unresolved emotional residue from a conversation you had 3 days ago, the sensory input of the room you were sitting in.
Even the subtle social atmosphere and tension around you.
Yes, and even broader environmental fields.
Yeah.
Your mind is not a closed factory. It is a highly porous, dynamic, participatory field.
Can you give a concrete example of how that field changes the bubbles?
Sure. You will generate an entirely different set of thoughts, worldview, and self-perceptions when you are severely sleep-deprived and slightly dehydrated compared to when you have slept 8 hours and feel physically thriving.
Oh, without a doubt.
You will generate different thoughts when you feel socially supported by your peers versus when you feel isolated or criticized.
I can absolutely validate the biology part. I mean, I know for a definitive fact that my internal monologue becomes roughly 90% more apocalyptic and fatalistic when I have skipped lunch.
The hangry effect.
It's real. The concept of being hangry isn't just a funny internet joke. It is a profound demonstration of a biological state hijacking the cognitive narrative.
Exactly. Biology dictates the conditions for emergence. You might have the sudden overwhelming thought, my entire career is a complete disaster and I am a total failure.
But that complex narrative might literally just be the cognitive brain's clumsy, dramatic translation of the raw biological data that says, my blood sugar is currently crashing and my cortisol is spiking.
But because we suffer from the illusion of absolute authorship, the very millisecond that catastrophic thought appears, the self violently grabs it and claims ownership.
I say, my thought, my absolute truth. Therefore, my life is indeed a catastrophic disaster.
We relentlessly personalize every single random mental fluctuation. We treat passing biological bubbles as existential threats or deep, dark confessions of our true hidden character.
And the moment you begin doing that, your mind ceases to be a tool and transforms into a terrifying, inescapable courtroom where every passing notion is put on trial for its life.
Chavan backs this up with a psychological phenomenon in the text that is so incredibly common, yet we never deeply question what it implies.
Oh, the feeling of surprise.
Yes. He points out the genuine, jarring surprise we constantly feel at our own minds. How many times a week do you catch yourself asking, where in the world did that memory come from?
Or Why did my brain just randomly picture a horrible car crash while I was washing the dishes?
Exactly. Or, why did I snap and react so aggressively to such a minor comment? If we were truly the deliberate, conscious authors and architects of every single thought, we would never, ever experience the feeling of surprise.
Because we would have planned it.
Right. The sheer existence of that surprise is the ultimate proof that we are very often merely witnessing thoughts emerge into our consciousness, not consciously manufacturing them.
That flash of surprise reveals the fatal crack in the illusion of total control. It proves we are participating in a larger field where phenomena simply emerge.
But here's the critical juncture where massive human suffering is generated. Modern culture completely ignores this nuance. It teaches us only two extreme, highly destructive ways to interact with our minds.
We are either taught to blindly and religiously obey our thoughts. Always trust your gut, follow your mind, your feelings are absolute truth.
Or we are taught to violently and aggressively fight them.
Crush your negativity.
Conquer your fears, banish weak thoughts.
We are almost never taught the middle path, which is to simply observe them as transient, highly contextual biological movement that requires no immediate intervention.
Now, I know there's a common pushback here.
Yeah, I have to push back hard here too, actually, because to a lot of listeners, this sounds like a very dangerous, slippery slope into total nihilism or avoidance.
People often worry about that.
If I am not the author of my thoughts, and they are genuinely just random bubbles popping up from my biology, my past trauma, and my environment, doesn't that render me a completely passive, helpless passenger trapped in the meat suit of my own brain?
It can sound that way if misinterpreted.
Right. Like, where does personal responsibility possibly fit into this framework? If I have a sudden cruel thought about a coworker, can I just shrug and say, hey, don't blame me, it was just a bubble from the field, I take no responsibility?
That is the single most crucial distinction Chavan makes in the entire book.
It sounds like you were saying the mind is less like a disciplined factory producing widgets on command and more like a shaken up bottle of carbonated water where bubbles just naturally and chaotically rise to the surface. But ultimately, who is responsible for deciding whether or not to drink the soda?
Well, it is vital that we do not misinterpret his work as a free pass to become irresponsible, reactive, or destructive.
Yep.
Recognizing that thoughts naturally emerge like bubbles absolutely does not mean you are a helpless, passive passenger in your life.
Okay, so how does it work?
The framework shifts the location of your responsibility. Because while you may not author the spontaneous emergence of the thought, you remain entirely 100% responsible for your conscious participation with it.
Okay, I need you to clearly delineate those two concepts, the difference between emergence and participation.
Emergence is the biological reality of the bubble rising into consciousness. Let's say an incredibly intense, intrusive thought suddenly pops up out of nowhere. I should scream at my boss and quit my job this very second.
Okay, yikes.
You did not consciously, rationally, sit down at a desk and decide to carefully construct and generate that thought. It spontaneously emerged from a highly pressurized field of chronic stress, sleep deprivation, or accumulated workplace frustration.
So you are not responsible for the fact that the thought appeared. That is emergence.
Correct. Participation, however, is everything that happens in the milliseconds and minutes after the bubble appears. Do you violently grab that bubble, reinforce it, feed it immense emotional energy, weave it into a permanent narrative about how you are fundamentally disrespected, and then act destructively upon it until it dictates your material reality?
Or do you observe it, recognize it simply as a flashing biological signal of severe overload, take a deep breath, and let it dissolve without allowing it to detonate your career?
Exactly.
Ah, okay. The light bulb just went on. So I don't control the bubbles that rise from the depths, but I have absolute control over which bubbles I decide to chase around the room with a butterfly net.
Yes, you control the net. And furthermore, over a longer timeline, you absolutely have the power to shape the conditions of the underlying field itself.
You can change the environment.
Yes. You have the agency to intentionally change your physical environment, to build healthier daily habits, to engage in deep therapeutic work, to process unresolved trauma, to prioritize sleep, and to foster meaningful, regulating relationships.
By doing all of that, you are fundamentally changing the chemical and psychological nature of the liquid in the bottle, to use my metaphor.
Exactly. A healthier, more coherent field will naturally, effortlessly generate different types of bubbles over time. But the fatal trap is demanding, with authoritarian rigidity, that the field never, ever produce a negative or fearful bubble again.
That level of perfection is biologically impossible. And the violent attempt to force it is precisely what creates the endless, exhausting war inside your head.
It's an unwinnable war.
That reframing offers such a massive, profound wave of relief. It takes this crushing moral weight off the simple human act of occasionally having a weird, negative, or fearful thought.
It really does.
But this realization actually leads us directly into a massive psychological mystery. If thoughts are truly just transient, fleeting bubbles, and we know we don't have to claim ownership of them, why do certain highly negative thoughts and incredibly destructive behavioral patterns stick around so stubbornly for years?
The patterns that just won't die.
Right. Why do we repeatedly get trapped in painful, exhausting loops that our conscious, rational minds desperately hate? Why do I keep dating the exact same emotionally unavailable person, or why do I keep staying in the exact same cycle of chronic burnout at work?
Chavan answers this by exposing the hidden, often terrifying architecture of the mind. He introduces the continuity-seeking self.
The continuity-seeking self. This part was intense.
This specific concept is arguably one of the most profound and paradigm-shifting insights in modern psychology, and Chavan dissects it brilliantly. It completely flips our traditional understanding of human motivation upside down.
Yes.
In Western culture, we generally operate under the foundational assumption that the core self primarily and always seeks happiness, truth, peace, or pleasure. We assume we are driven toward the light.
Right, that we all just want to be happy.
But Chavan argues that deep beneath those conscious, surface-level desires, the nervous system seeks something far older and far more primal. It primarily seeks orientation and continuity.
Orientation, like a biological compass. It doesn't necessarily care if the scenery is pretty, it just desperately wants to know which way is north.
Exactly. The continuity-seeking self acts like a powerful form of psychological gravity. Its primary job is to hold your subjective experience of reality together so that you maintain a stable, predictable, coherent narrative.
A narrative of exactly who you are, how relationships functionally operate, and what rules you must follow to survive in your specific environment.
It is obsessed with familiarity, and the startling, often highly uncomfortable truth that emerges from this is that the continuity-seeking self will almost always prioritize familiar, predictable pain over uncertain, unfamiliar freedom.
That is an incredibly dark concept, but the second you hear it, it makes so much horrifying sense. Why would the human mind, an organ designed for survival, actively prioritize familiar pain over happiness?
Because, to the primitive layers of the nervous system, familiar pain provides reliable orientation. If you spent your formative years growing up in a highly chaotic, emotionally volatile household, or if you've spent the last decade surviving in a hyper-competitive, high-stress corporate job, your nervous system has deeply, fundamentally adapted its entire architecture to survive in that specific environment.
So pain, stress, and hypervigilance become intricately woven into the very fabric of your continuity.
Your brain maps the chaos. It learns, okay, this intense pressure is what baseline reality feels like. This is the specific mechanism of how I survive here. You know the unwritten rules of the game, you know exactly when the explosions are going to happen, and you know how to dodge them.
You possess orientation even if the game is actively destroying your health.
It's the ultimate manifestation of the phrase, the devil you know is better than the angel you don't.
Yes, and we severely underestimate how terrifying the angel you don't is to the human nervous system. Because genuine freedom, deep emotional healing, or massive life transformation does not simply act as a soothing balm that relieves pain.
No, it threatens the foundation.
True transformation actively, aggressively threatens the established continuity structures that the core self has painstakingly built around that pain to survive. If chronic suffering, victimhood, or the frantic hustle of overwork has organized your fundamental identity, dictated your relationship dynamics, and structured your daily rhythms for 10 years, then suddenly removing that suffering instantly removes your entire source of orientation.
You are left floating in a void.
So, to the continuity-seeking self, the process of healing doesn't feel like a relief. It actually registers as a profound existential threat.
It creates an intense, visceral, existential dread. The subconscious self quietly, frantically asks, who am I if I am no longer struggling against this weight?
How do I even relate to other human beings if I'm not playing the role of the victim, or the heroic savior, or the perpetually stressed-out workaholic?
Chavan provides some incredibly powerful, heartbreaking examples of this dynamic in action. Think about a person who is finally finding the courage to pack their bags and leave a highly toxic, abusive relationship.
A huge step.
Consciously, cognitively, they desperately want freedom. They know, logically, that the relationship was destroying their life. Yet, the exact moment they walk out the door and are finally safe, They don't feel a wash of overwhelming cinematic peace.
They feel intense, paralyzing physical anxiety. They feel a powerful, almost magnetic compulsion to go back to the abuser.
And what makes it so much worse is that society and their well-meaning friends looks at them and says, "What is wrong with you? You are finally free. You should be so happy. If you go back, you are just self-sabotaging because you secretly love the drama."
And then the person internalizes that immense shame.
Exactly. But Chavan's entire point is that they are absolutely not self-sabotaging. Their nervous system is simply experiencing severe, terrifying disorientation. That nervous system learned exactly how to survive inside the predictable emotional chaos of that toxic relationship long before it ever had the chance to learn how to survive in a state of peaceful, unregulated autonomy.
Peace feels incredibly unfamiliar, and to the primitive threat detection centers of the brain, unfamiliar immediately equals dangerous.
Or take a less extreme but equally common example, someone recovering from severe, chronic professional burnout. They finally take a full week off to truly rest. They turn off their phone.
But instead of sinking into the couch and relaxing, they feel immense, crushing guilt, physical agitation, and a racing heart.
Why? Because their entire continuity structure, their entire sense of worth, was built exclusively on the identity of being relentlessly productive and highly essential. The mere act of resting threatens to annihilate that identity.
This changes everything about how we view our own failures. What this essentially means is that when I am doing something that looks like quote-unquote self-sabotage, when I am aggressively procrastinating on a lifelong dream, or when I inevitably fall back into a destructive habit I swore I'd break me, I am not actually broken.
No, you're not.
My brain isn't defective. It is simply trying to forcibly drag me back into a neighborhood it recognizes, even if the houses in that neighborhood are all burning down.
That is precisely what it means. The brain is desperately trying to keep you on a fully mapped street. Fully internalizing this realization dissolves an enormous amount of personal shame.
It really does.
You are not stubbornly clinging to your suffering because you harbor some dark, secret enjoyment of being miserable. You are clinging to it because your nervous system fundamentally trusts recognizable suffering more than it trusts unfamiliar, untested coherence.
It is a biological survival mechanism, not a moral failure.
Oh.
Your nervous system trusts recognizable suffering more than unfamiliar coherence. That is a realization that takes time to truly sink in. It implies that learning to be happy is actually a physical skill. It takes time for the nervous system to learn through repeated exposure that peace is actually survivable.
It's a practice.
And this revelation sets up the next crucial phase of Chavan's philosophy. Because when this continuity-seeking self feels threatened by the prospect of real change, when we try to pack up our bags and finally move out of that familiar, painful neighborhood, it doesn't just let us walk out the door quietly.
No, it generates massive internal friction.
It generates what we commonly call resistance. Modern self-help culture has a very clear, highly aggressive doctrine on how to handle resistance. It tells us to crush it, push through the pain, grind it out, conquer your inner weakness.
But Chavan argues that this militarized approach to our own minds is a catastrophic error. We have to completely redefine how we view resistance. We must learn to see friction as feedback.
Friction as feedback.
Okay. Modern culture almost universally views any form of internal resistance as a distinct moral defect. If you hesitate before starting a project, you are labeled lazy. If you chronically procrastinate, you lack discipline and drive.
If you feel a wave of fear or doubt before making a big leap in your life, you are told you have a weak mindset that needs to be eradicated. We are actively taught to declare total war on our own hesitation.
But Chavan flips that entirely. He says resistance is not an enemy invading the castle. It's a critical communication signal.
Yes, he asks us to completely reframe resistance as vital informational feedback. Very often, the resistance you feel is not a sign of failure or laziness. It is a highly intelligent signal that the underlying biological and psychological system is actively undergoing a massive reorganization.
And if we connect this back to the broader mechanics of biology, we see that all living systems naturally and inevitably resist abrupt destabilization.
Think about the mechanics of physical exercise, like lifting heavy weights.
Right. Muscle fibers must literally tear at a microscopic level and experience localized inflammation, which is biological resistance, before they can adapt and grow stronger.
An immune system intentionally creates a fever and inflames the body, creating massive systemic friction before it can successfully heal an infection. Psychological systems behave in the exact same way.
So what we call procrastination or fear is often just psychological growing pains,
Yeah.
the fever of the mind trying to heal.
Exactly. When an old, outdated pattern of continuity begins to naturally weaken and a new, healthier pattern hasn't fully stabilized yet to take its place, the entire system enters a highly vulnerable, transitional middle territory.
This middle territory is structurally unstable.
And the nervous system brilliantly communicates that temporary instability to your conscious mind through the physical and emotional feeling of resistance. It's the system's way of flashing a yellow light saying, "Caution, we are rapidly losing our familiar orientation. We are entering unmapped territory. Are we absolutely sure this is safe before we proceed?"
And what happens when we follow the modern self-help advice and decide to actively fight that resistance? When we pull out the motivational videos, drink 3 energy drinks, and try to violently bulldoze our way through the hesitation.
We create a highly destructive state that Chavan calls resistance against resistance.
It's a double bind.
You experience the completely natural, unavoidable friction of psychological change, and then, because of cultural conditioning, you viciously attack yourself for feeling it. You layer immense shame, anger, and forced artificial pressure on top of a system that is already deeply unstable.
You essentially divide your own mind into warring factions.
Right. One part is desperately trying to grow and change, another primitive part is desperately pulling the emergency brake to stay safe, and a third, supervisory part, is aggressively attacking the entire system for being so slow. It multiplies the internal exhaustion exponentially.
You burn out not from doing the work, but from fighting yourself about doing the work.
Let's make this highly concrete using some of the scenarios from the text. Chavan talks specifically about the resistance we feel toward nonstop grinding productivity. Society and our bosses will immediately tell you that you are being lazy if you can't maintain a relentless hustle 24/7.
But Chavan argues that your visceral resistance to nonstop productivity is very rarely laziness. It is almost always the nervous system highly intelligently detecting an unsustainable, potentially dangerous physical overload.
The friction, the sudden urge to just stare at a wall, is a protective biological signal saying, we cannot possibly maintain this level of energetic output without incurring severe biological damage.
It is trying to save your life.
Or consider the intense hesitation people feel before a major positive life transition. Getting married, accepting a massive promotion, or moving across the country to a city they've always loved.
Society says, don't get cold feet. Jump. You're ruining your blessing.
But that hesitation isn't weakness or self-sabotage. It is simply the continuity structure naturally, predictably destabilizing under the immense weight of massive uncertainty. It is the brain trying to manage the agonizing tension between the conscious desire for growth and the primal biological need for predictable continuity.
Now, I absolutely love this framework in theory.
Yeah.
It is incredibly compassionate, and it removes so much of the toxic shame we carry around daily. But I have to pose a highly practical, rubber-meets-the-road dilemma here. If I decide to adopt this philosophy, and I simply accept all of my internal resistance as valid informational feedback, how do I ever actually get off the couch and achieve anything?
That is the big fear, right?
Exactly. How do I possibly tell the difference between my nervous system is intelligently reorganizing and needs a break, and I am just straight up avoiding doing my taxes because I'd rather watch television? If we label every single impulse as valid information, doesn't that inevitably lead to total behavioral paralysis and a completely chaotic life? We can't just coddle every urge to quit.
It is a vital, necessary question, and Chavan is exceptionally clear on this point. He is absolutely not advocating for passive surrender to every passing whim, fear, or desire to avoid discomfort.
So he's not saying just give up.
No, that would be completely abandoning structure and discipline, which also completely fails to create a coherent, functional life. The profound difference lies not in blindly obeying the resistance, but in how you choose to investigate it.
Investigate it, okay.
When you operate under the assumption that all resistance is just laziness, your only tool is to blindly attack it with a hammer. Conversely, when you assume all resistance is profound trauma, your only tool is to blindly coddle it. Intelligent awareness requires a third path, discernment.
So what does that discernment actually look like in real time? How do we investigate it without getting sucked into the surveillance trap we talked about earlier?
You fundamentally change the question you ask yourself. You must stop asking, how do I violently destroy this resistance right now? And you must start asking with genuine curiosity, What specific data is this resistance trying to communicate to me?
Like the tax example.
Exactly. You sit down to do your taxes, and you feel massive friction. The resistance might be communicating a genuine lack of financial organization, a deep-seated fear of discovering you are in debt, or simply the mundane biological reality that staring at spreadsheets is incredibly understimulating and boring.
Once you accurately identify the specific communication, you can address the actual issue, rather than just universally condemning yourself as a lazy failure.
You can say, okay, I am feeling intense friction right now, not because I am broken, but simply because this task is boring and highly stressful. I acknowledge that friction. Now, how can I participate intelligently to get this necessary task done anyway? Maybe I need to play some music or break it into 20-minute chunks.
Yeah.
You acknowledge the friction without moralizing it into an identity crisis.
However, if the resistance is stemming from severe 6-month-long adrenal burnout, the intelligent participation might actually be to physically stop working, email your boss, and rest.
I see. It's the difference between mercilessly whipping a horse that refuses to move forward versus simply getting off the horse for a moment to see if there is a venomous snake in the road blocking its path, or if the horse is just dehydrated and needs water before it can continue the journey.
Precisely that. You cultivate a stance of curiosity toward the friction rather than a stance of innate hostility. And the truly surprising paradox here is that when you finally stop attacking your own resistance, when you stop creating that secondary layer of warfare, the nervous system very often feels safe enough to relax, the perceived threat level drops, and the resistance naturally lessens on its own, allowing you to finally move forward with a fraction of the effort.
Which acts as the perfect conceptual bridge to the ultimate thesis of Chavan's work. Because if we strip away everything we've discussed, if we aren't supposed to force positivity using a psychological corset, and we aren't supposed to aggressively police our thoughts like a totalitarian dictator, and we aren't supposed to violently crush our resistance with sheer willpower, what exactly are we supposed to do?
How do we actually live?
How do we actually function and live a meaningful life in this framework? Chavan's concluding answer is a state of being he calls intelligent participation.
This concept of intelligent participation is the core thesis of the entire book, distilled into a single, profound shift in psychological orientation.
The ultimate revelation.
It is. Genuine peace comes exclusively through understanding the system, not through attempting to violently control it. The goal of human development is absolutely not to achieve a perfectly quiet, entirely frictionless, eternally positive mind. That is a biologically impossible standard that only serves to create endless suffering.
The true goal is to achieve flexible coherence within an environment of constant uncertainty.
Intelligent participation. I really love the phrasing of that. It implies that you are highly active and engaged in your own life, but you aren't dominating it. You are dancing with it, not wrestling it to the ground.
Think of your mind as a vast, highly complex ecological system. You cannot control the weather in an ecosystem. You cannot command the wind to start blowing, or the rain to stop falling, or the lightning to stop striking. And in this metaphor, those weather events are your spontaneous thoughts, fears, and emotions.
But you absolutely can intelligently participate in that ecosystem. You can build a sturdy shelter. You can intelligently choose which seeds to plant in which soil. You can decide where to direct the beam of your attention.
The human mind suffers the most when it arrogantly attempts to freeze a living, fluctuating dynamic system into a state of permanent, rigid certainty. Intelligent participation, or what Chavan sometimes calls participatory awareness, is the learned ability to observe a terrifying thought bubble rise to the surface without immediately owning it as your identity.
It is the ability to feel the heavy friction of resistance in your body without immediately declaring a moral war on yourself. It is the art of navigating the complexities of human life without demanding that your mind operate like a highly optimized, perfectly serene, unfeeling machine.
The book actually provides a practical reset page at the end of this section, and I want to share some of those highly tangible takeaways for anyone wondering how to start doing this today.
That would be really helpful.
We already discussed the power of changing the internal question from how do I eliminate this feeling to what is this feeling communicating? But what are some of the other methods? How do we practically shift from a regime of control to a practice of participation in our daily lives?
One of the most powerful, immediate practical resets Chavan offers is fundamentally shifting how we handle the onset of difficult, compressing emotions. Usually the moment we feel sadness or anxiety, we immediately panic and ask, how do I feel better right this second?
Mm,
Which instantly triggers the traps of suppression or forced positivity.
right.
Instead, Chavan suggests asking a radically different question. Can I simply allow this feeling of compression to exist in my body for exactly 5 minutes without making any attempt whatsoever to fix it, judge it, or change it?
The 5-minute rule.
You simply fit with the biological reality of the compression. You don't build a permanent identity around the sadness, but you also don't wage war against it. You just let the nervous system process the chemical signal until it naturally dissipates.
It's exactly like driving your car and seeing the check engine lights start flashing on the dashboard. You don't immediately take a piece of black tape and cover the light so you can pretend everything is fine, but you also don't immediately pull over on the highway and violently rip the entire engine block apart in a panic. You just notice the light, you acknowledge it, and you keep driving for a bit to see how the car is actually handling.
Yes, that space between noticing the light and ripping the engine apart is where freedom lives. Another vital reset he offers is recognizing that you absolutely do not need a perfectly quiet, supremely confident mind in order to take meaningful action in your life.
You can feel the intense fear, you can fully acknowledge the massive uncertainty of the situation, and you can still choose to take the step forward.
The goal of life isn't fearlessness. It's learning the skill of acting alongside the fear, carrying it with you, without letting it dictate the final outcome of your choices.
Reflecting on this entire philosophical and biological framework, it brings us immense, profound sense of relief. It genuinely feels like we have spent our entire adult lives standing in the middle of a raging, powerful river, desperately trying to wrestle the water into submission.
We've been throwing heavy rocks at the current.
We've been trying to freeze the water with our bare hands. We've been shouting at the river to flow the other direction. And as a result, we are so unbelievably tired. And Chavan is essentially just standing calmly on the riverbank, calling out to us, telling us to start fighting the infinite power of the water, and instead to come to the shore and learn how to build a boat.
Learn to build a sturdy boat and learn how to intelligently navigate the currents. Because the currents will always inevitably change. There will be terrifying rapids, and there will be stretches of beautifully calm waters. True psychological intelligence, the kind that actually sustains a human life, is not the impossible ability to stop the river from flowing. It is the hard-won ability to sail it.
Let's summarize the massive, paradigm-shifting journey we've just been on today. We started by completely deconstructing the modern trap of toxic, forced positivity, realizing that violently forcing ourselves to perform happiness is like wearing a psychological corset that eventually suffocates our genuine capacity to experience life.
We look deeply into the sheer hidden exhaustion of recursive overthinking, that terrifying fatigue of the watchful eye that turns our natural awareness into an endless, punishing internal interrogation.
We fundamentally reframed our relationship to our own thoughts, recognizing them no longer as absolute truths or commands from our core identity, but as transient, spontaneous bubbles emerging from a highly complex biological and environmental field.
We learned how to generate immense empathy for our continuity-seeking selves, finally understanding that we often stubbornly cling to our familiar pain simply because our nervous systems biologically prioritize orientation over the terrifying prospect of uncertain freedom.
And finally, we redefined the very nature of resistance, learning to listen to it as vital informational feedback during periods of necessary reorganization, rather than violently fighting it as a personal moral failing. We have conceptually moved from a brutal paradigm of violent internal control to a sustainable practice of intelligent, compassionate participation.
And as we bring this deep exploration to a close, I want to offer a final lingering thought for you to carry with you and mull over in the days ahead. If we truly accept Chavan's premise, if we accept that your mind is fundamentally not a broken problem to be solved, if it is not an enemy combatant to be defeated, or a mechanical corporate project to be endlessly optimized, then what exactly happens to all of that massive bound-up energy you've been spending every single day fighting yourself?
Think of the sheer volume of willpower you use to police your thoughts.
What could you possibly build? What art could you create? Or who could you deeply connect with if you took all of that immense exhausted energy you currently spend managing your internal world and redirected it entirely outward into the beautiful, messy, unpredictable reality right in front of you?
What an incredible, expansive question to leave on, because the ultimate goal of diving deep into this material, and really the true goal of trying to understand the incredibly complex machinery of our own minds, is never, ever about achieving a state of flawless, static perfection. It is simply about finding just a little more grace and a little more understanding for our human biology so we can finally lay down our weapons, stop fighting that exhausting invisible war, and actually start experiencing the life we have. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.